Welcome. Tonight, you're invited to leave behind the noise of the day and step quietly into a different time. A time of war, silence, and secrets. This is not a story of battlefield charges or roaring engines, but of stillness, illusion, and a group of unlikely heroes whose weapons were not guns or tanks, but paintbrushes, speakers, and stagecraft. During the chaos of World War II, while bombs fell and armies clashed across continents, a small and secret unit was formed. Not to fight, but to deceive. Their mission was simple yet extraordinary: to trick the enemy into believing what wasn't real, and to do so with such precision, it could change the course of battles. They were artists, actors, sound engineers, and designers. And together, they became known as the Ghost Army. Tonight, as you settle in, let the quiet sound of rain and the gentle rhythm of this story guide you into calm. What you're about to hear remained classified for decades. Hidden in the shadows of history, this is the tale of how imagination, creativity, and illusion helped save thousands of lives. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let yourself drift. The story is about to begin. The wind moved softly across the fields of northern France, brushing gently through the tall grass like a whisper from the past. The moon, low and heavy in the sky, hung just behind a veil of clouds, casting an ethereal silver glow on the quiet countryside. It was late, so late that even the owls had grown still, and only the occasional rustle of leaves or the creak of an old wooden post reminded the earth that time still moved forward. In the distance, the muffled thud of artillery sounded like thunder from another world. Not close, but not far enough to forget. A war was being waged. A war that had already consumed entire cities, displaced millions, and reshaped the lives of everyone it touched. And yet here, in this sliver of land tucked between hedgerows and narrow dirt roads, the night felt suspended, as if the world itself had paused to take a breath. Scattered among the shadows were tents, low and unassuming, arranged in irregular clusters, almost invisible in the darkness. Inside, soldiers lay wrapped in thick wool blankets, their helmets tucked under their heads, rifles beside them like cold companions. Some slept fitfully, twitching with dreams they wouldn't remember. Others lay wide-eyed, staring into canvas ceilings, thinking of home, of letters unanswered, of mothers and fathers, of lovers they hadn't seen in years. There was a particular kind of stillness that came during wartime nights. Not peace, never peace, but a fragile, temporary silence. A silence filled with the weight of everything unspoken. Of fear, exhaustion, and the constant ache of not knowing what the morning might bring. But among these soldiers was a group unlike any other. Men who didn't belong in trenches or behind heavy artillery. Men who, just months earlier, had never held a gun, let alone worn a uniform. They were illustrators, designers, set builders, sound technicians. Men who had made their living in ad agencies, fashion houses, and Broadway theaters. Now they found themselves deep in enemy territory, surrounded by war, yet not here to fight in the way most others did. This was the beginning of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a secret American unit assembled not to destroy, but to deceive. Their mission was simple in words, but staggering in ambition: to trick the German military into believing what wasn't real, to move entire divisions that didn't exist, to create the illusion of strength where there was none, and to mislead enemy forces through sound, sight, and sheer creativity. They were actors, artists, and engineers. Their weapons were paint and rubber, wires and amplifiers. They built inflatable tanks that looked convincing from a distance. They recorded the roar of moving convoys and blasted it through massive speakers hidden in the woods. They crafted fake radio transmissions, impersonated officers, and constructed entire camps, only to vanish days later, leaving behind only tire tracks and fading footprints. No other unit in American military history had ever been like them. And for decades after the war, no one even knew they had existed. But tonight, In the quiet between night and dawn, their story begins. Imagine a soldier sitting by a dim lantern, sketching the outline of a fake tank while listening to the steady beat of a metronome, timing engine sounds for a future performance. Another, nearby, paints mud streaks onto canvas to mimic real wear and tear. A third adjusts wires, listening through headphones for just the right sound of a moving Jeep. Not too fast, not too slow. All around them, the real war continues. Real bombs fall. Real men die. But here, in this strange corner of the conflict, the battlefield is a stage. And the enemy? An unwilling audience. There's something poetic in that, isn't there? In the idea that even amidst so much death, creativity could still thrive. That illusion could be wielded as protection. That deception, in the right hands, could save lives rather than take them. As you settle into this story, let the weight of history soften. Let the details wash over you gently. Tonight, there will be no loud battles, no sudden turns. Only quiet courage, hidden genius, and the slow, steady unfolding of a secret nearly lost to time. Close your eyes and listen closely. The whisper in the night is only beginning. Long before the Ghost Army ever set foot in Europe, long before the first rubber tank was inflated or a single radio message forged, the idea was already forming, quietly, cautiously, in the minds of military planners and artists alike. The year was 1942. The world was at war, and the United States had just entered the fight. The full weight of the conflict was only beginning to settle on the shoulders of American soldiers, many of whom were still fresh from farms, factories, and universities. But deep within the War Department, and even deeper inside the corridors of creative thought, a question was taking shape. What if victory didn't always require more firepower? What if, instead of meeting the enemy head-on, you could convince him to go the wrong way entirely? Deception, of course, was nothing new in warfare. From ancient China to the beaches of Normandy, every great general understood the value of misdirection. Sun Tzu once wrote that all warfare is based on deception, a principle that echoed across centuries. But World War II brought a new scale to everything, and with it came new possibilities. The British had already begun experimenting with deception techniques. In North Africa, the famed British officer Dudley Clark had orchestrated fake units and misleading radio chatter to confuse German forces in the desert. They built dummy tanks from canvas, sent fake dispatches over open airwaves, and even created a fictitious army commander to lead imaginary divisions. The results were striking. The enemy responded not to strength, but to illusion. American strategists took notice. Back in Washington, the idea of forming a specialized deception unit began to gain traction. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and the Signal Corps began collaborating with artists, stage designers, and sound engineers. They weren't looking for sharpshooters or paratroopers. They were looking for illusionists. One of the first to push the idea forward was Colonel Billy Harris, a military planner with a talent for creative thinking. Alongside him was Ralph Ingersoll, a publisher and writer who had traveled through war zones and understood the power of performance. Together, they envisioned something bold, a self-contained unit capable of simulating entire divisions, all with inflatable vehicles, scripted radio chatter, and expertly designed visual effects. To bring the idea to life, they needed talent, not military muscle, but artistic precision. So they began to recruit, pulling from the best art schools and design firms in America. They looked for painters who could replicate camouflage patterns under pressure, engineers who could build a bridge out of plywood that looked real from the sky, men who could forge voices over the radio, mimicking accents and speech patterns as though they had lived a lifetime in the field. Among the earliest recruits were students from the Cooper Union and Pratt Institute, graduates from Yale School of Art, and sound technicians from RCA and Bell Labs. Some had backgrounds in fashion illustration, others in Hollywood set design. A few had never held a gun until basic training. It was a strange mix. Artists in uniform, illusionists in helmets. But that strangeness was part of the charm. These men didn't think like soldiers. They thought like creators. And that's exactly what the war needed. As the unit began to take shape, it was officially named the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Within it were several unique subunits, including the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the 3102nd Sonic Company, and the Signal Company Special. Each one had a specific role: visual deception, audio deception, and radio deception, working together in a careful choreography of confusion. The men trained at Camp Forest in Tennessee and later at Pine Camp in New York. There, they experimented with materials, honed their techniques, and studied the enemy. They practiced making tanks vanish overnight, tested how sound traveled over hills, and learned how to speak like soldiers they would never meet. They were preparing for a war unlike any other. One fought in silence from the shadows. But even in those early days, not everyone believed in the mission. Some commanders doubted the practicality of an army made of rubber and sound. Others scoffed at the idea of placing artists on the front lines. Yet as the months went on, and as more Allied operations revealed just how effective deception could be, the skepticism began to fade. War, after all, is not just about bullets. It is about belief, about what the enemy thinks he sees. And in that space between perception and reality, the Ghost Army would find its strength. By the time the unit shipped out to Europe in early 1944, they were ready. Not just with equipment and plans, but with an unshakable sense of purpose. They knew their job was dangerous. If discovered, they could be killed. They had no heavy weapons, no armored support. Only wit, creativity, and the hope that their illusions would hold just long enough. As the ships crossed the Atlantic, many of them stood on deck, sketchbooks in hand, watching the sea swell beneath gray skies. They weren't ordinary soldiers, and they weren't going to fight an ordinary war. They were going to perform it. They came from cities and towns across America, their hands once stained with ink, charcoal, and paint. Some were barely out of art school. Others had already made names for themselves, designing advertisements for magazines, painting portraits, illustrating books, or working on the backlots of Hollywood. They were used to brushes and pencils, not bayonets and bullets. And yet, when the war called, they answered. Not with rifles, but with talent, imagination, and a strange sense of patriotic duty. The men who would become the heart of the Ghost Army were unlike any other group in the U.S. military. Among them were fashion illustrators from New York, industrial designers from Detroit, architects, sculptors, and stage technicians. One had studied under renowned artist George Gross. Another had been featured in prestigious art exhibitions before ever donning a uniform. A few had never traveled outside their home state, let alone across an ocean. Some of the names would one day become famous. Bill Blass, who would go on to become a world-renowned fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly, who would leave his mark on the world of abstract art. Art Kane, who would become one of the great photographers of the 20th century. But back then, they were just young men in uniform. Volunteers for a mission so secret, they were told almost nothing at first. What united them wasn't rank or background. It was vision, an ability to see the world not just as it was, but as it could be made to appear. They knew how to play with light and perspective, how to craft illusions that could fool the eye from a distance. And in war, that was a gift as powerful as any weapon. At training camps in the United States, they were issued uniforms and rifles, like any other soldiers, but also sketchbooks, pencils, measuring tape, and rolls of canvas. They learned to inflate rubber tanks and arrange them to catch the right shadows at the right time of day. They practiced building dummy artillery pieces and painting fake tire tracks that led nowhere. They studied how to simulate activity in a camp, hanging fake laundry, placing mannequin sentries at guard posts, even setting up fake latrines to suggest the presence of hundreds of troops. Their war would be one of details. If even a single tree was placed where it shouldn't be, or a tank's shadow fell the wrong way at dusk, the enemy might see through the illusion, and the entire operation could collapse. But it wasn't just about tricking the Germans. These men had to trick their own minds as well. They had to become the illusion. Walk like soldiers from other units. Wear the insignia of divisions that weren't actually there. Speak the lingo. Slouch like engineers. laugh like infantrymen. They were, in every sense, actors on the world's deadliest stage. In the quiet evenings after training drills, many would retreat to their bunks and draw, sketching not battle plans, but portraits of their bunkmates, scenes from memory, imagined cities. It was how they stayed grounded, how they remembered who they were, and who they still hoped to be once the war ended. There was a gentleness to these men, not weakness, never that, but a softness of spirit that hadn't been hardened by the front lines. And yet, they were being prepared for missions that would put them closer to the enemy than most. They would go forward, often ahead of real troops, and set up the illusion of strength. They would have no backup, no cover, only air and light and shadow to protect them. Still, they trained with care. They learned how far a rubber tank could be carried by 6 men, how to stake it into the earth so it wouldn't tip in the wind. They experimented with sound projection, testing the way recorded tank engines echoed through forests. They built scripts for fake radio transmissions, designed to sound just real enough to fool German interceptors. Every detail mattered. For some, it was exhilarating, a strange blend of art and espionage. For others, it was unnerving. "If we're caught," one of them reportedly said, "we'll be the most ridiculous prisoners of war ever taken." But beneath the jokes and sketches lay something deeper. A quiet understanding that their work, however odd, had meaning. They might not take cities or raise flags, but if they could save real soldiers by drawing enemy fire away from the truth, if their illusions could preserve life, then their mission was worth it. These were artists at war, and they were about to embark on one of the most unusual and unsung chapters in military history. There was no grand ceremony, no flags waved, no crowds gathered. When the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially activated in January of 1944, it happened not with fanfare, but with quiet paperwork, sealed envelopes, and an overwhelming sense of secrecy. Those who joined didn't even know at first what exactly they were becoming part of. Orders were vague, assignments were coded, and the mission, the true mission, was known only to a handful. But in time, slowly and deliberately, the pieces began to come together. The unit was designed as something completely new, not a traditional combat force, not even a support group. It was a mobile deception unit, one whose job was to impersonate other units of the US Army and mislead the enemy. To exist and not exist at the same time. The name itself, 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, sounded ordinary enough. Official, bureaucratic. But beneath that label was a collection of sub-units that would come to define the very essence of illusion. The backbone was the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, responsible for visual deception. These were the artists, the designers, the sculptors, and builders. They crafted what the enemy would see. The inflatable tanks, the fake artillery, the dummy airplanes, the decoy camps. From a distance, sometimes even up close, their creations looked astonishingly real. And when placed with care, under the right light, surrounded by just enough movement and noise, they became believable. Then came the 3132nd Sonic Company, a newly formed unit equipped with experimental technology. Their job was to create sound and to project it across the landscape in such a way that it would mimic entire divisions on the move. They worked with engineers from Bell Labs to develop recordings of tanks starting, trucks shifting gears, soldiers shouting, equipment rattling. Every sound had to be layered and timed. The projection systems they used, massive speakers mounted on jeeps, could throw these sounds more than 15 miles in the right conditions. Next was the Signal Company Special, charged with radio deception. They were the invisible voice of the Army, sending out fake transmissions designed to be intercepted by the enemy. Operators practiced mimicking the radio handwriting, the unique habits and rhythms of real units. They spoke in code, hinted at troop movements, created the illusion of strategy. And the Germans listened. Supporting them all was a small group of administrative and logistics personnel who helped coordinate operations, scout locations, and manage the delicate balance between real and fake. At its full strength, the Ghost Army numbered around 1,100 men, a tiny fraction compared to the divisions they impersonated, which often numbered over 15,000. But that was the brilliance of it. With just over 1,000 artists, engineers, and specialists, the Ghost Army could simulate the presence of entire corps, shifting the balance of power, confusing enemy scouts, and buying time for real troops elsewhere. Their gear was packed into trucks and trailers. Inflatable tanks were folded like canvas tents. Loudspeakers were covered with tarps. Radios were tucked behind false panels. To the untrained eye, they looked like a supply convoy, nothing more. But in reality, they carried with them an arsenal of illusion. The men lived simply. They slept in tents, cooked their meals over portable stoves, wrote letters home under dim lantern light. Yet their daily tasks were far from ordinary. One morning they might be setting up a fake airfield. The next, they'd be sketching a layout for a phantom motor pool. They practiced inflating a full-size Sherman tank in under 30 minutes. They rehearsed the movements of convoys, how to make 5 trucks look like 50. Secrecy was everything. Most of the Army didn't know they existed. Even the units they were impersonating were often unaware that decoys were being placed in their name. The fewer people who knew, the better the illusion. And still, beneath the layers of planning and performance, these men remained, at their core, ordinary people. Young, curious, creative. They cracked jokes. They played cards. They sketched caricatures of their officers and painted pin-up girls on their canvas duffel bags. Some kept journals, not of battles, but of thoughts. The kind of thoughts that come only in the stillness between operations. In those quiet moments when they wondered if what they were doing truly mattered, or if it would all be forgotten. The Ghost Army wasn't about glory. There were no medals for their missions, no victory parades. What they did had to remain invisible, even their successes. But as the months went on and they deployed across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and eventually Germany, their presence would be felt, not by sight or sound, but by absence. By the battles that didn't happen, the attacks that were diverted, the soldiers who lived because the enemy had been fooled. Their war had begun, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a staged performance in the fog of war. And for the men of the 23rd, that was enough. Before the Ghost Army could set foot on European soil, before the first illusion was ever deployed in the field, there were long weeks, even months, of testing, training, refining, and convincing. Their ideas were bold. Their tools were unorthodox. And in the cold logic of military command, illusion alone was not enough. It had to be tested. It had to work. So, behind the curtain of secrecy, the men trained. Not on distant battlefields, but on quiet American soil. In wooded stretches of Tennessee, along back roads in New York, and in open fields that mimicked the terrain of faraway France. They weren't practicing how to fire rifles or storm bunkers. They were rehearsing deception. Each day was a lesson in blending the imaginary with the believable. They would begin by selecting a space, an empty meadow, a flat ridge, or a winding road. Then, piece by piece, they built the illusion of an army. First came the inflatables, rubber tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces, folded like tents and hauled in canvas bags. Once inflated, they looked remarkably real, especially from the air or from a distance. The men learned how to place them at proper intervals, how to shape tire tracks into the soil using wooden rollers, and how to dirty the vehicles just enough to make them appear used. Next came the details. Dummy soldiers, mannequins dressed in full uniform, were positioned at watch posts. Laundry lines were strung between trees with real clothing hung out to dry. Campfires were lit, and smoke machines used to simulate kitchen tents. Engineers laid out mock radio antennae. Crude mess halls were built, filled with empty crates and half-eaten rations. Nothing was left untouched. It was all about the feeling of occupation, the subtle cues that, when seen from afar or overhead, signaled a living, breathing force. The sonic team was not idle either. They tested sound projection in forests, through hills, and across rivers. Loudspeakers mounted on jeeps emitted layered recordings of moving tanks, shouted orders, hammers hitting metal, even distant laughter. The goal was to make it seem as if an entire convoy was nearby, resting, preparing, or on the move. Timing was everything. Volume, direction, even the natural echo of the trees. All of it had to be considered. Meanwhile, the radio deception team practiced scripting conversations that felt real but were entirely false. They studied the communication habits of real divisions, how officers spoke to each other, what codes they used, how frequently they transmitted. Then they mimicked them. They didn't just use the same phrases. They learned the rhythm, the quirks, the mistakes. It wasn't acting. It was becoming. And still, the skeptics remained. Officers from other units, old-school commanders raised on infantry and steel, sometimes came to observe the training exercises. Some were curious. Others were outright dismissive. How can rubber tanks stop a bullet? They'd ask. What's the use of art against artillery? The men of the 23rd didn't argue. They let their illusions speak for them. During one exercise, a group of high-ranking officials was brought to a ridge overlooking a division supposedly camped below. The observers surveyed the scene through binoculars, noting the neat rows of tanks, the tents, the moving trucks. It wasn't until the briefing ended, and a few soldiers began deflating the tanks, that the officers realized they'd been fooled. Silence followed. Then, slowly, nods of approval. The illusion had held. These early field tests weren't just about practice. They were about trust, proving to the military establishment that deception could be strategic, not just theatrical. Every success built credibility. Every failure taught valuable lessons. How far could the sounds travel? How close could enemy scouts get before seeing through the trick? How quickly could an entire fake unit be deployed? Or removed? Mistakes were made, of course. Once, a tank began to slowly collapse during a demonstration, deflating with an awkward sigh as if exhaling the truth. Another time, a rubber vehicle blew slightly off course in the wind and had to be quietly chased and restaked by red-faced engineers. These mishaps earned laughs within the unit, but also led to better anchoring techniques, reinforced seams, and stricter protocols. Every test made the illusion stronger, but even in the midst of this focused training, the men never lost their creative spark. They doodled on their tents, painted murals on canvas, sketched each other in spare moments. Some even began keeping illustrated journals, recording their strange war, not with reports and statistics, but with lines and color. Their notebooks, many of which survive today, are filled with portraits, landscapes, and quiet moments. A soldier sipping coffee under a tarp, an inflated tank peeking through trees, a fake jeep bathed in golden morning light. Behind the curtain, a performance was being shaped. One that would unfold not on a stage, but in war zones. And when the curtain finally lifted, when the Ghost Army was deployed to Europe, they would step into their roles with quiet precision, not as warriors, but as illusionists. To most, war was defined by destruction, bombs, bullets, blood, and fire. But to the men of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, war became something else entirely. It became a canvas, a shifting stage where every hill, every field, every shadow could be repurposed into a tool for illusion. This wasn't the war of textbooks or newsreels. This was a war of brushstrokes, measurements, angles, and tricks of the eye. The soldiers of the Ghost Army approached deception not as a crude cover-up, but as a carefully constructed art form. They weren't hiding tanks. They were creating the appearance of tanks. And they understood something that only artists truly grasp. Reality is often shaped by perception. If the enemy believed what they saw, even for a moment, then the illusion had succeeded. The process began with planning. Maps were studied not just for terrain and roads, but for lines of sight, natural backdrops, and how the sunlight would fall at different hours. What did the field look like from above? From the forest edge? From a church bell tower 5 kilometers away? They would then sketch layouts, often in pencil or ink, imagining how an entire armored division might camp there. Where would the fuel trucks go? What tents would be visible from a reconnaissance plane? Would fake tank tracks lead logically to and from the scene? Each detail mattered. War, they understood, was not only chaos, it was also pattern. And if their illusions didn't follow those patterns, the deception would unravel. The inflatable tanks, perhaps the most iconic symbols of the Ghost Army, were works of ingenuity in themselves. Made of rubberized fabric, they could be carried folded and inflated within minutes using air pumps. Once standing, they measured up to 18 feet long, with detailed exterior textures designed to catch light and cast convincing shadows. The soldiers painted them to match the muddy, battle-worn tanks of the front. Smudges of grime, marks of rust, even simulated bullet dents were added to make them look lived in. But tanks were only the beginning. They constructed fake artillery guns with long barrels made of wood and cloth, balanced on metal tripods. Trucks were assembled from plywood frames with canvas coverings, often parked under trees with open hoods, suggesting repairs in progress. Dummy planes were laid out at airfields, complete with fake runways and oil drums. From the air, everything looked alive. To simulate human presence, they became set designers. Mess tents had dirty dishes and handwritten notes. Latrines had visible paths leading to and from them, made by dragging boots through the mud. Laundry lines were strung with uniforms of all sizes. Helmets were placed on sticks to resemble sentries at a glance. Even garbage was staged. Food wrappers, empty tins, broken crates, all carefully arranged to look accidental. It was theater on a battlefield, and every man, knowingly or not, became an actor. When enemy aircraft were expected overhead, the men walked in slow, repeated paths, pretending to be busy soldiers. They mimed lifting crates, checking tires, inspecting supplies. A few even created fake traffic jams with inflatable jeeps and cardboard signs. The goal was never to convince an enemy up close. It was to sell the story at a distance, to shape what a German pilot might report after a 5-second glance from 5,000 feet in the air. The artistic thinking extended to misdirection as well. If real troops were preparing to move into an area from the east, the Ghost Army might stage a fake camp to the north, drawing enemy attention in the wrong direction. Sometimes they'd intentionally leave leaks in radio traffic, hinting at the location of units that didn't exist. And always, the illusion was paired with sound and radio tricks to make the lie complete. It was a strange feeling, creating something so convincing, knowing it wasn't real. Some soldiers wrestled with the irony of it all, building tanks that wouldn't fire, camps that would disappear overnight, armies made of rubber and hope. But they also understood the stakes. For every bullet not fired at a real unit, for every German division sent chasing shadows, lives were saved. And in the quiet hours, after the illusions were set and the fake soldiers stood their posts, the men would return to their tents, sometimes with charcoal still on their fingers, and draw. Not tanks or planes, but moments. A sunrise over a misty valley. A comrade laughing over instant coffee. The way light filtered through pine trees onto an empty road. They were artists in a place where art wasn't supposed to belong. But perhaps that was the very reason they were there, to remind the world, and perhaps themselves, that imagination had power. That even in the ugliest moments of history, creativity could carve out its own kind of beauty. And that sometimes, it wasn't strength that changed the course of battle, but a carefully painted illusion. If sight could be deceived, sound could be manipulated. And in war, where every noise could signal movement, danger, or retreat, sound itself could become a weapon. The men of the Ghost Army understood this better than anyone, particularly those of the 3132nd Sonic Company, a unit so secretive, even within the Deception Corps, it seemed a mystery. Their job was simple in theory: make the enemy hear what wasn't there. But in practice, it was an intricate dance of acoustics, technology, and artful performance. The foundation of their work began in quiet studios, far from the front lines. In a warehouse outside of New York City, sound engineers from Bell Laboratories and RCA met with the military's most creative minds. There, over weeks and months, they recorded the actual sounds of war. The low rumble of tanks starting in the cold, the grinding gears of a half-track in motion, the clatter of equipment being unloaded, shouted orders, boots over gravel, and even the distant idle of engines at rest. They built a vast audio library, carefully cataloged by volume, range, and rhythm. Every sound was recorded with military-grade microphones, edited with surgical precision, and layered in a way that could simulate not just a tank, but an entire armored column moving across fields, down roads, or setting up camp. The results were astonishing. Close your eyes, and you wouldn't just hear a machine. You'd feel the weight of it. Imagine the dust, the heat, the sweat of men coordinating the effort. But producing the sounds was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in projecting them across real terrain, in real time, without giving away the trick. The 3132nd was given custom-built sound trucks, jeeps equipped with massive speakers mounted on rotatable turrets. These speakers could throw sound over 15 miles, bouncing it off hills, trees, and buildings, creating the illusion that it came from somewhere else entirely. To the unsuspecting ear, it sounded like an approaching force, too large to ignore. Before each deployment, the sonic team would scout the landscape. They studied the acoustics of each valley and plain, noting how sound would carry through fog, how it echoed off stone or was absorbed by forest. Some nights, they sat in silence, listening to the wind, gauging how far a whisper might travel. Then, when the moment was right, the performance began. They played carefully curated tracks in sequence. Tanks would rumble into place. Trucks would unload supplies. Engines would idle. Orders would be shouted. Chain clinks, metal scraping, canvas tents flapping in the wind. All of it came alive in a coordinated soundscape designed to fool even the most experienced German scout. Sometimes, to make the illusion stronger, the visual team would set up decoys nearby. A few inflatable tanks, a dummy camp, even a fake motor pool. Paired with sound, the deception became almost impossible to doubt. But even without visuals, sound alone could shift the course of battle. During one operation, the sonic team staged a false bridge crossing. The real engineers were preparing a silent maneuver elsewhere, while the Ghost Army projected hours of recorded bridge-building noises. Hammering, splashing, commands echoing over water. German forces, listening in from the shadows, redirected their troops to intercept a crossing that wasn't happening. The real operation succeeded. Quietly, safely, and unopposed. To outsiders, the men of the 3132nd seemed like magicians, hiding entire armies in their speakers. But within the unit, they were methodical, scientific, almost reverent about their work. Each night, after deployment, they would test equipment, recalibrate speakers, record environmental feedback. Sound, after all, was unpredictable. A gust of wind could ruin everything. A hillside could turn a growl into a whisper. So they adapted. Always. But there was something strange about their kind of war. At night, when the tapes had been packed away and the jeeps parked beneath trees, the men sat around in near silence. Men who had just created the loudest false army imaginable. They spoke in low voices, as if afraid that their own deceptions might echo back at them. Some wrote letters home, others simply listened to the wind. And in those quiet hours, they knew. The war they fought wasn't about volume. It was about belief. And if they could make the enemy believe, then the noise had done its job. In war, the air is never truly silent. Even when the guns pause and the skies grow still, the invisible waves above the battlefield continue to hum. Voices flicker in and out of static. Codes are exchanged, names repeated, coordinates shared. To the trained ear, every signal carries weight. Every transmission a puzzle, every silence a warning. The men of the Signal Company Special understood this world intimately. They didn't carry paintbrushes or operate giant speakers. Their weapon was the radio, and with it, they built entire fictional armies, one message at a time. Radio deception, known as spoofing, was one of the most delicate and dangerous elements of the Ghost Army's operations. It required not only technical skill, but deep psychological insight. The goal was simple, yet profound: to mimic the radioactivity of real Allied divisions so convincingly that the Germans would believe those units were in places where they weren't. And to do that, the signalmen had to disappear completely into their roles. Each operator was assigned a real division to impersonate: the 6th Armored, the 4th Infantry, the 82nd Airborne. They studied every detail: what frequencies that unit used, how many transmitters were active at once, how often messages were sent, and in what style. It wasn't enough to know the codes. They had to replicate the rhythm, the timing, the voice print of that unit's radio presence. Just like handwriting, every radio operator had subtle habits: a slight pause before signing off, a preference for certain phrasings, the speed of their Morse code. These quirks were noted, memorized, and reproduced because German intelligence officers were listening. Always. The signal teams operated in pairs. One man would send messages. The other would act as a second transmitter from the same unit, replying, echoing, confirming. Together, they would simulate an entire battalion's worth of communication. From afar, it seemed as if a division was moving into the area. But in truth, it was just 2 men and a transmitter, hidden in the trees. There were dangers. If they made a mistake, if they used the wrong call sign or sent a message out of rhythm, the Germans might catch it. Worse, it could endanger real units operating nearby. So the men rehearsed endlessly. Every transmission was scripted, reviewed, adjusted. They timed their messages to match troop movements, weather changes, even time zones, making the illusion as airtight as possible. They also used radio silence as a tool. Sometimes, the lack of communication was the loudest signal of all. If a real division was known to transmit hourly and suddenly fell silent, it might suggest movement, engagement, or retreat. The Ghost Army manipulated these expectations, creating gaps and bursts of chatter in just the right pattern. The result: an invisible army, buzzing in and out of the airwaves, shaping the enemy's perception with nothing but sound and silence. One of their most successful operations took place just days before a real Allied assault. The signal team began broadcasting as if the 4th Armored Division had arrived near the Belgian border. Their messages were intercepted, cataloged, and passed up through German channels. Reconnaissance planes were sent. Troops were repositioned. The real 4th Armored, of course, was more than 100 miles away, moving undetected toward its actual target. The deception worked. No shots fired, no vehicles moved, just radio. It was an eerie kind of warfare. The operators spent long hours hunched over their equipment, often in complete isolation. Their only connection to the outside world was the soft click of the key, the hiss of static, and the imagined voice of an enemy who might be listening just beyond the fog. They spoke calmly, without emotion. They became someone else entirely, the voice of a division that didn't exist. And when their shift ended, they would step out into the forest, stretch their legs, and vanish back into the larger illusion. No medals, no glory. Only the quiet knowledge that somewhere the enemy had believed their lie and moved accordingly. To many, it seemed a ghostly craft, a battle waged on airwaves. But in truth, it was one of the most vital threads in the web of deception. For in modern warfare, it was no longer enough to see or to hear. One had to believe. And through their mastery of silence and sound, the signalmen of the Ghost Army made sure the enemy believed in armies that were never there. In the theater of deception, even the most brilliant illusion could be ruined by a single careless shadow, a tank that cast no shade in the midday sun, a tent that stood too bright against a fog-dimmed field, a tire track that bent in the wrong direction. To the Ghost Army, these were not minor details. They were threats. And so, alongside their inflatable tanks and booming speakers, the men of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers carried with them a different kind of weapon: the eye of an artist. Camouflage, in its simplest form, is the art of not being seen. But for these soldiers, it was much more. It was the art of being seen and misunderstood. Their goal wasn't just to hide. It was to make the enemy see what wasn't there and trust it. It began with color. Before each operation, scouts would survey the terrain, not for danger, but for tone. Was the soil dry and yellowed? Wet and brown? Did the trees still have leaves? What hue was the grass at that time of year? The team would then match paint mixtures to mimic those surroundings. Inflatable tanks were coated with matte colors, mixed on-site to reflect the season and the weather. Not too clean, not too dark. Every vehicle bore imperfections, brush marks, dust, deliberate smudges. Even canvas tents were chosen and positioned based on how the wind would move them. A gently fluttering tent edge might give the illusion of life, but too still, too symmetrical, and it began to look like what it was, a fake. Then came shadow work, a subtle, often invisible practice. Real tanks have weight. They compress the earth beneath them. They throw shadows that change across the day. The engineers studied these effects. They learned how the early morning sun would hit a turret, how branches would drape over real vehicles. Using ropes, stakes, and fabric, they created artificial shadows where none existed. Sometimes they painted shadows directly onto the ground, a trick learned from stage sets and murals. To simulate movement, they used light. Headlights were faked using flash lamps and angled mirrors. Fires were lit inside fake kitchens to cast flickering light across dummy soldiers. Even the reflective sheen of engine grease was mimicked with oil-colored paint, giving the illusion of heat and wear. The engineers also thought vertically, from the perspective of enemy aircraft. Aerial reconnaissance was a constant threat, and so everything had to be convincing from above. Camouflage nets were draped over vehicles, then patterned with leaves, twigs, and rags to blend into the natural cover. Trenches and foxholes were sometimes carved just for show. Mud was spread by hand to simulate the churn of many boots. There were times when an entire camp, dozens of vehicles, tents, and supplies had to be built and disguised within a single night. Under cover of darkness, the men worked silently, inflating tanks, rolling out tarps, painting, anchoring, arranging. They moved in practiced rhythm, like stagehands behind a curtain. And by dawn, what had been an empty field became the bustling camp of a non-existent division. Sometimes the deception became a strange form of beauty, a row of fake tanks gleaming in morning fog. Dummy trucks positioned just so along a forest road. The symmetry of tents glowing under moonlight. Soldiers took pride in their arrangements. They stepped back to admire their illusions, not unlike sculptors appraising a finished piece. In a world torn by ugliness, they had found a strange form of quiet artistry. But there was always risk. If a German patrol spotted a tank's rubber seams, or noticed that the same soldier was standing watch for hours without moving, the illusion could collapse. And so, vigilance was constant. Mannequins were adjusted every few hours. Footsteps were dragged to create the illusion of passage. Even waste, broken crates, used ration tins, was staged to suggest human activity. In one operation, they went so far as to create a fake fuel depot, complete with barrels, hoses, and the smell of gasoline, which they carefully spilled in small amounts. It worked. German planes flew over the next morning, snapped reconnaissance photos, and redirected airstrikes away from the real supply line. Camouflage, it turned out, wasn't just about hiding. It was about storytelling. Everything had to fit together. Light, shape, motion, placement. A tank wasn't just a prop, it was a character. A tent wasn't just fabric, it was a signal. And the whole scene was a narrative designed for enemy eyes, crafted to make them draw the wrong conclusion. As night fell and the team packed up to move on, their work often vanished with them. Tanks deflated, tracks erased, campfires extinguished. Within hours, all that remained was an empty field, and the faint memory of a shadow that had never belonged to anything real. And yet, in that emptiness, the Ghost Army found their purpose, because sometimes what you don't see can be just as powerful as what you do. The wind that swept across the fields of Normandy in June 1944 carried more than the scent of soil and rain. It carried the weight of expectation, of fear, of history in the making. Just days earlier, Allied forces had stormed the beaches in one of the most daring military operations the world had ever seen. D-Day. And now, behind those broken hedgerows and battered towns, the true test of deception was about to begin. The men of the Ghost Army had landed in France quietly, without ceremony. No cheering crowds, no press, just cargo ships, canvas bags, and whispered orders. They arrived after the first wave of combat, but still close enough to hear the thunder of artillery in the distance and feel the earth tremble beneath their feet. For months, they had trained for this, sketched plans, practiced inflating tanks in the rain, memorized radio codes, rehearsed broadcasts, painted fake mud on rubber armor. But now, the stakes were real. This was not Tennessee, not Pine Camp. This was war. Their first assignment came near a small village, nestled among the bocage, the dense maze-like hedgerows that defined the French countryside. The Allies needed to shift divisions north to support a major push toward St. Lo. But to do so, they had to convince the Germans that their forces remained in the south, holding ground, preparing to strike. The job fell to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. In the cover of early morning, the Ghost Army moved in. A convoy of trucks rolled down a narrow road, headlights dimmed, tires crunching on wet gravel. At a crossroads hidden by trees, they stopped. There was no time for hesitation. The terrain was measured. The men moved swiftly. Inflatable tanks were unpacked and laid out like tents. Air compressors hummed softly. Within minutes, the field began to take shape. By sunrise, what had been an empty meadow now held what looked like a battalion of Sherman tanks, supply trucks, and fuel depots. Painted canvas covered fake artillery. Dummy soldiers stood watch. Laundry lines were strung. Campfires smoked just enough to be seen by enemy eyes on distant ridges. Overhead, a recon plane passed. The illusion held, but visual deception was only the beginning. That night, the Sonic team positioned their speaker trucks along the forest line. With the switch of a dial, the air filled with low rumbles, the distant churn of tank engines, the clank of chains, shouted orders, metallic echoes. It played in loops, sometimes changing subtly, as if men were moving between tents or refueling. From a mile away, it was impossible not to believe. Meanwhile, the radio team began broadcasting messages using the call signs of a real division. The Germans, listening in, began to track the presence of what they believed was an armored force preparing for an offensive. Reports filtered through enemy lines. Troops were shifted, scouts redirected, artillery repositioned, and all the while, the Ghost Army remained unseen. For 3 days, the illusion continued. Patrols circled the perimeter. Signals were sent. Tire tracks were reinforced. The fake soldiers ate, moved, and worked. Real civilians passed by and waved, unaware that the army they were seeing was made of rubber and wires. But it wasn't without tension. At night, the men heard German engines in the distance. Once, a scout was spotted near the edge of the woods. Another time, a shot rang out, distant but sharp. The unit stayed silent, weapons ready. None of the Ghost Army's men had heavy artillery. If the enemy attacked, their only defense was to vanish before they were discovered. And so, on the 4th day, they began the dismantling. Tanks were deflated, tracks swept, fires extinguished. Within hours, the field was empty again, as if nothing had ever happened. But the effects lingered. Thanks to the deception, the real division had moved safely. Reinforcements had reached the front. German forces had been misled and misdirected, not by firepower, but by paint, sound, and illusion. The operation was declared a success. For many in the Ghost Army, it was the first time they felt the full weight of what they had signed up for. Not just tricks, not just performance, but real strategy, real danger, and real lives, protected by the smoke and mirrors they had built. Later that evening, as the trucks rolled onto the next site, one soldier wrote in his journal, "We fooled them, not for applause, not for medals, but because a man on another road got to live. That's enough." It was a quiet victory. the kind they had come to expect. And it was only the beginning. It began with a map, a patch of open land, crisscrossed with dirt roads and framed by orchards and low stone walls. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than countryside, like hundreds of other places in France. But to the Ghost Army, it was an opportunity, a blank stage waiting for its scene. The mission was clear: create the illusion of a full Allied division passing through and temporarily setting up camp near a rural crossroads. The location was of strategic importance, a key intersection where the Germans had concentrated artillery in the past. If they believed a major force was arriving there, they would likely redirect attention, leaving other roads open for real movements elsewhere. But this time, the assignment was different. It wasn't just about faking a few tanks or simulating a noisy convoy. This time, they needed to create an entire village, complete with soldiers, vehicles, command posts, and even signs of civilian activity. And they had less than 12 hours to build it. The operation began just after sunset. The sky was overcast, the air damp and cold. The perfect cover for shadows and silhouettes. Trucks moved in without headlights, creeping down narrow farm roads. The moment the engines stopped, the work began. Inflatable tanks and jeeps were deployed in staggered lines across fields. Folding wooden structures resembling small buildings, tents, barracks, a supply depot, were erected with surprising speed. Camouflage nets were stretched between trees. Smoke pots were lit in ditches to mimic chimneys. Loudspeakers were tested under blankets to mute the setup noise. Then came the subtleties. The team set up fake road signs, painted overnight in military stencils, pointing to imaginary battalions. Mailbags were stuffed with old newspapers and dropped at the mock command post. A small chapel tent was pitched, complete with a painted cross. Inside the mess tent, tables were laid out with tin trays, old ration boxes, and smudged cutlery. On a clothesline strung between two fence posts, socks and undershirts fluttered in the night breeze. Near the edge of the setup, a military police checkpoint was staged with sandbags, fake barrier arms, and two mannequins wearing MP helmets, posed to suggest watchfulness. To the casual observer, or the lens of a reconnaissance aircraft, it looked alive. Too alive to be false. By 3 a.m., the team turned to sound. The 3100-second Sonic Company began playing recorded loops of soldiers arriving. Trucks pulling in, boots over gravel, shouted commands, the hiss of gas lanterns, the occasional murmur of laughter. For hours, the night sang with the sounds of an army that wasn't there. Meanwhile, the signal company sent out radio messages from a tent labeled Operations. Their transmissions mentioned supplies, patrol rotations, and phantom infantry units approaching from the east. They carefully timed gaps and bursts of chatter, simulating shifts in duty, coordination with invisible allies. As dawn approached, mist settled in the low grass. The scene was perfect, like a photo snapped at just the right moment. And that's exactly what the Germans did. High above, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane flew past. It circled once, twice, then vanished into the clouds. Somewhere behind enemy lines, analysts would soon be examining grainy photographs showing an unmistakable Allied presence. They'd see the tanks, the trucks, the tents, the men. They'd mark the crossroads as occupied. The truth, of course, was something entirely different. By the time the sun crested the horizon, the Ghost Army was already packing up. Tents were collapsed, vehicles deflated, netting folded, tracks obscured with rakes and bundled branches. Within 3 hours, the village had vanished. Only the faintest traces remained. A few footprints, a smudge of black soot, a single empty coffee tin left deliberately in the weeds. Later that day, the real Allied convoy passed through a different route, undisturbed. German troops had repositioned north to confront the force they believed had already moved in. And the Ghost Army? They were already miles away, setting the stage for their next illusion. That night, under a different sky, one soldier wrote in his field notebook, "We built a place that never existed." And yet, for a brief moment, the enemy believed it did. That makes it real enough. It was, perhaps, the perfect metaphor for the Ghost Army itself. A presence that could not be touched, only felt. A whisper in the fog. A shadow cast by nothing. A village that never was, and yet changed the course of the day. Distraction. A word so simple, so harmless in conversation. Yet on the battlefield, it becomes a matter of life and death. A well-timed distraction could mean the difference between a safe retreat and an ambush, between a successful advance and a massacre. And for the Ghost Army, distraction wasn't just a tool, it was their purpose. They were never meant to win battles, not in the traditional sense. They weren't the ones storming bunkers or clearing minefields. Their victories were measured in moments. Moments when the enemy looked in the wrong direction. Just long enough. The Ghost Army perfected the art of drawing the eye, of planting doubt, of bending reality to their will. And they did it by turning the battlefield into a stage. Imagine a crossroads deep in occupied France. To the west, a real Allied division was preparing to push forward. A crucial maneuver requiring stealth and speed. But the enemy was watching, scouting, calculating. A direct move would be too risky. So the Ghost Army moved into the east. Within hours, the 23rd had transformed a quiet field into the illusion of strength. Tanks that breathed no smoke, tents filled with mannequins, trucks made of wood and canvas. Loudspeakers pumped out the sounds of bustling soldiers and revving engines. Radio transmissions spoke of non-existent operations. To German scouts, it looked like an impending attack. The enemy responded. They shifted troops, repositioned artillery, reinforced a flank that no one intended to strike. And when the real assault came, from the opposite direction, it caught them unprepared. This was not luck, this was precision. The men of the Ghost Army understood what to show and what to hide. They knew that the human mind fills in blanks, that under pressure and uncertainty, people believe what they expect to see. If a single tank was placed just right, with proper shadows, and backed by convincing sound and motion, the enemy would assume there were dozens more. If a fake command tent transmitted confident orders, a whole brigade might appear behind it. Sometimes the art of distraction was dangerously intimate. In one operation near the German border, Ghost Army soldiers set up their illusion just 2 miles from enemy lines. At night, they whispered in hushed tones, lit fires only briefly, and moved under the cloak of darkness. By daybreak, their setup was complete. A phantom division seemingly entrenched and ready to fight. Meanwhile, the real division they were protecting snuck through a valley on the other side. Undetected. There was risk, always. These men carried sidearms, but no heavy weapons. If discovered, they wouldn't last long in a firefight. Their protection came from their performance, from how well they could sell the lie. To do so, they even impersonated officers. Some soldiers dressed in the insignia of higher-ranking commanders, wandering through nearby villages or stopping at visible intersections. They made sure they were seen by locals, and perhaps by enemy spies posing as civilians. The goal was never to blend in. It was to be noticed, to suggest that something important was happening right where the Ghost Army stood. They learned to stage human behavior as carefully as they staged equipment. A man pacing outside a tent, checking his watch. Another scribbling on a clipboard. A group standing in formation. At a glance, it all looked real. But perhaps the most powerful weapon they used was not what they added, but what they left out. The absence of noise in one direction. The unexpected presence of a roadblock. A visible fuel depot without fuel trucks. These small mismatches were like seeds of doubt planted in the minds of German observers. Doubt that made commanders hesitate, redirect, delay. And in war, delay can be everything. Distraction, it turned out, wasn't about being loud. It was about being just believable enough. About creating a story the enemy would tell themselves, and then act upon. At night, when the fake tanks were deflated and the sonic recordings faded into silence, the men of the Ghost Army would sit quietly near their trucks, sipping coffee from tin mugs. They rarely saw the results of their work firsthand. But they knew. Somewhere, a real soldier had moved safely because they had drawn the spotlight away. It was a strange kind of heroism. Anonymous, invisible, but no less vital. And the better the distraction, the more lives they saved. It was one thing to inflate a tank, another to rig a speaker, but to become someone else, to step into the boots, uniform, and behavior of a man who didn't exist, that was something altogether different. For the men of the Ghost Army, deception didn't stop at props and sound. Their mission required them to become actors, improvisers on the grandest and most dangerous stage of all, the battlefield. They didn't just build illusions, they lived them. Every operation demanded not only physical setups, but the performance of a unit that was supposed to be there. That meant behaving like soldiers from divisions they were impersonating, sometimes down to the smallest habit. A man who had trained as an illustrator might now walk with the confidence of a logistics officer. A sculptor might wear the insignia of a seasoned engineer and nod knowingly at passing trucks, as though evaluating supply chains. They wore patches of other divisions, memorized the locations and nicknames of regiments they were impersonating, and even practiced speaking in regional accents to match where those units were supposedly from. To avoid suspicion, they moved as if they had always been there, just part of the landscape. It was theater in its purest form, but the stakes were life and death. Ghost Army soldiers wandered through nearby villages, making themselves visible to locals and to enemy informants hiding among the population. They drank in taverns, asked for directions, exchanged greetings in halting French. They spoke in casual tones about fake plans and phantom units. Every conversation, every glance, every movement was carefully calculated to plant a story in someone else's mind. At times, they even forged entire headquarters. They set up fake command tents, complete with painted signs, phone lines that didn't connect to anything, and officers walking briskly with briefcases. Inside, maps covered with pins and colored threads were spread across tables. On the surface, it looked like the nerve center of a real military campaign. But it was all performance. Some men thrived in these roles. They joked that they were the Army's first and only Field Actors Guild. But for others, the constant pretending wore thin. There was something unsettling about walking through war as a shadow, as a copy of someone else. They weren't fighting like the soldiers in the headlines. Their heroism left no footprint. Their victories had no parades. Worse still, they knew that if they were caught, dressed in false uniforms, impersonating officers, they would not be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. They would be considered spies. The punishment for such deception was clear: summary execution. And yet they went on. They practiced their parts, rehearsed their lies. They became living ghosts, not truly present, yet everywhere at once. At night, when the masks were off and the uniforms packed away, they would sit together in low light and talk quietly, wondering how long they could keep playing the part before someone saw through it. Some kept journals, writing in third person, as if to distance themselves from the roles they had assumed. Others drew sketches of real faces under false helmets, caricatures of fake divisions, or the silhouettes of men who only existed in name. And then there were moments that blurred the line completely, like the time a German scout observed the Ghost Army's camp from a hilltop. He watched for hours, scribbling notes, convinced he was witnessing an elite armored division in motion. He reported what he saw. His commanders acted on it. A real Allied unit advanced elsewhere, undetected. That day, every man in the Ghost Army played his role perfectly. No one broke character. No one doubted the lie. It was strange, they later recalled, to know they had been seen, but not as themselves, only as the mask, the illusion, the decoy. Living a lie was exhausting, but it was also liberating in a way that only they understood. In becoming someone else, they had found purpose. In acting out a fiction, they had saved lives. And in a war filled with so much death and destruction, that small, invisible legacy of presence without violence, of courage without recognition, was something they could hold on to. They were never supposed to be remembered, but they never forgot who they had to become, so that others could make it home. For all the artistry and precision, for all the quiet brilliance of the Ghost Army's illusions, there was always something lurking just beyond the canvas, just beneath the speaker static. Real danger. Their job was to pretend to be something they weren't. And in a war where mistaken identity could lead to ambush or execution, pretending came with a cost. The men of the Ghost Army had no heavy weapons, no artillery, no armor. They were artists, engineers, radio operators, and actors carrying pistols. And sometimes, not even those. The tanks they deployed wouldn't fire. The soldiers they staged were mannequins. Their job was to look like a target, without the means to defend themselves if the enemy took the bait. Every operation meant placing themselves in harm's way. Often, they were closer to the front lines than the real troops. That was the point. They needed to be seen, to draw the enemy's attention. But it also meant they were exposed. German scouts could be watching from tree lines. Enemy artillery might respond to false movements. Snipers could mistake a mannequin for a commander and fire without warning. There were near misses, some too close for comfort. During one deployment in the Ardennes, a unit had just finished setting up their inflatable vehicles and fake encampment when the silence of the forest was shattered by a single sharp crack. A bullet, fired from somewhere unseen. It hit nothing. A warning or a misfire. No one moved. The air held still. Somewhere someone had seen something and almost acted. The team quietly deflated one tank, moved the speaker truck back 200 yards, and waited. The illusion had worked. Maybe too well. Another time, while impersonating a command convoy, a small Ghost Army detachment stopped near a village to stage a scene. Officers, maps, supply crates. A civilian passed by and nodded. Hours later, a shell landed just beyond the road where they'd stood. The German artillery had taken the bait, but had come dangerously close to finding the truth. And then there was the psychological toll. Walking around in a stolen identity, dressed in the insignia of a real division, made every step feel like walking a tightrope. Under the laws of war, if they were captured while in disguise, especially wearing the rank of an officer, they could be executed as spies. This was not a theoretical threat. They knew the rules. They carried cards in their pockets explaining their real roles in case of capture, hoping it might spare them, if they ever had a chance to explain. But they also knew that in the heat of war, there were no guarantees, no time for explanations. And yet, despite the danger, they kept performing. They whispered orders in fake command tents. They created tire tracks that led nowhere. They set up mannequins at outposts and sat quietly in the brush, watching, hoping no one came closer to look. Because that was the real terror. If the enemy ever got close enough to see through it, there would be no curtain to hide behind. Just a few men in rubber boots, standing among fabric tanks and painted crates, hoping the illusion held for 1 minute longer. In one chilling case, a German patrol approached the outer perimeter of a Ghost Army operation, their vehicles stopping on a distant ridge. The team lay low, radios silenced, speakers cut. A few men reached for pistols they hoped never to use. The patrol turned back. Whether the enemy bought the act or decided it wasn't worth the risk, no one ever knew. But the men didn't forget how close they came to being exposed, and how empty their rubber tanks would have been if it turned to real combat. Still, they joked afterward. That was how they coped. If anyone ever fires on us, one of them wrote in his journal, we'll just bounce it back at them. Laughter, in small doses, helped ease the pressure. But the truth was clear to all of them. Behind every performance was a real threat. Their illusion protected others, but left them vulnerable. That vulnerability became part of their identity. They weren't just deceivers, they were decoys. And to stand in as a target, to draw danger to yourself for the sake of others, that required a kind of quiet, unshakable courage. They never fired a shot, but they took risks that most soldiers never would. Not for glory, not for medals, but because in the strange logic of war, the bravest thing you could do was pretend to be in danger, and hope the lie was strong enough to hold. Amid the noise of war, amid the whirring of compressors, the crackle of radios, and the low rumble of staged engines, there were moments when everything went quiet. No drills, no orders, just the low whisper of wind through canvas tents and the scratching of pens across paper. In those still moments, the men of the Ghost Army returned, not to their illusions, but to themselves. They wrote, Letters home, notes to sweethearts, scribbled thoughts in journals, sketches in the margins of Army-issue notepads. Some pages were filled with stories from the front, others with poetry. Some were funny, filled with inside jokes and exaggerated tales of inflated success. Others were heavy, quiet, uncertain. One soldier wrote to his wife in Ohio, "I spent today pretending to be a general, wore a borrowed coat and barked fake orders. A French farmer saluted me. I nodded like I knew what I was doing. I didn't. But he believed me. That's the strange part. Everyone believes everything here." Another wrote in his journal, "We built a bridge that won't carry a car, just plywood and paint. But someone photographed it today. I wonder if they'll bomb it tomorrow. I guess if they do, we've done our job." Some letters included tiny ink drawings, a jeep made of plywood, a camp full of mannequins eating invisible soup, a German plane overhead with "Fooled again" scrawled in the clouds. But not every entry was lighthearted. One young private, just 20 years old, wrote, "The guys joke, but it gets to you. You dress like a soldier who doesn't know your name. You march like men who aren't there. You wonder what happens when the lights go out and they come looking for the real thing." Many of these soldiers were artists before they were soldiers. Their letters were vivid, visual, layered with feeling. Some would paint watercolors on scraps of cardboard. Others pressed leaves into notebooks and annotated them, as if to preserve the colors of a world that still felt real. One man sent home a charcoal sketch of the French countryside. In the corner, he wrote, "We staged a battle here yesterday. The field was empty by nightfall, but it felt like something had happened, even if nothing did." These letters were not battlefield dispatches. They were human moments, preserved in ink and graphite. And they spoke of a very different kind of war, not of blood and steel, but of shadows and silence. Sometimes, the letters arrived home long after the sender had moved on to another operation, another illusion. Families received them without knowing where the writer was, or whether he was still where he claimed to be. Even in their letters, the Ghost Army maintained secrecy. They couldn't write about what they were doing, so they wrote around it. They described the rain, the food, the exhaustion. They talked about the way the wind sounded between hedgerows, about the dog that wandered through camp one day, sniffed a rubber jeep, and ran off. They wrote about missing birthdays, about wondering what their kids looked like now, about hearing music through a farmhouse window, and suddenly missing home so much it made their stomach hurt. They didn't ask to be remembered, but they left traces of themselves in every letter, every sketch, every soft-spoken memory. And long after the war ended, long after the tanks stopped moving and the speakers fell silent, those traces remained. In shoeboxes, in attic trunks, in museum archives and family albums. Reminders that even the quietest soldiers had voices. That even those who built illusions lived lives of deep, often unspoken truth. These were the ghosts behind the Ghost Army. Not faceless deceivers, but men. Young, tired, hopeful, afraid. And through their words, we see not only the war they fought, but the hearts they carried through it. The Ardennes was supposed to be quiet. By December 1944, Allied commanders believed the German army was on the defensive. The front line in the wooded hills of Belgium and Luxembourg was thinly held, stretching over 70 miles of snow-covered forests and icy roads. It was here, in this cold, quiet corner of Europe, that the Ghost Army found itself once again. They had been ordered into Belgium on another deception mission, this time to simulate the presence of the 9th Army in a vulnerable sector. Their task was familiar: build the illusion of strength, hold enemy attention, and mask the real troop movements happening far behind the lines. But what none of them knew, what no one knew, was that the largest German offensive since D-Day was about to begin. On the morning of December 16th, under the cover of fog and snow, Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, a surprise counterattack that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands of German troops, tanks, and artillery poured into the Ardennes, catching the Allies completely off guard. And in the path of that storm stood the Ghost Army. What had begun as another careful deception operation quickly turned into something far more dangerous. The unit, spread thin across several towns and back roads, had to respond, not just with illusion, but with improvisation. Orders came in fragments. Communication lines crackled with uncertainty. Real American units were retreating or being overwhelmed. Villages they had passed through just days before were now under fire. For the first time, the Ghost Army was no longer operating behind the front lines. The front had moved past them. And yet, even in the chaos, they continued to perform. In one Belgian town, the name now faded into field reports and faded photographs. The 23rd quickly set up a fake roadblock. They parked rubber jeeps across a narrow intersection, placed mannequins in military police uniforms, and lit fires in oil drums to simulate warmth and control. Nearby, sonic teams blasted the sounds of tank columns moving through the forest, while radio operators faked transmissions from the 9th Armored. It wasn't just about deceiving the enemy now. It was about slowing them down. If German units hesitated for even a few hours, if they diverted their path by just a few miles, real divisions could regroup, retreat, or dig in. And the illusion worked. Captured German field maps after the war showed enemy divisions rerouting around certain roads, expecting Allied reinforcements that didn't exist. One battalion even paused for nearly half a day, unsure of whether they were facing a division-sized force or an elaborate ruse. That hesitation may have saved thousands of lives further south. But the cost was real. For the Ghost Army, the danger had never been more immediate. Artillery landed closer. German patrols were spotted in nearby fields. At one point, a detachment had to abandon a setup mid-deployment, forced to flee under cover of darkness, leaving behind partially inflated decoys and hastily scattered camouflage netting. They didn't sleep much during those days. Snow soaked their boots, froze their hands. They worked in near silence, knowing that one wrong move could end it all. Still, they kept building illusions, even when it felt like the world around them was unraveling. In the chaos of the Bulge, they played perhaps their most daring role. At a crossroads north of Bastogne, with real American troops dangerously exposed, the Ghost Army created an elaborate deception. A full Phantom Brigade preparing for counterattack. They set up fake artillery, blasted the sounds of tanks loading shells, and lit fires visible for miles. The enemy paused. That pause gave time for real reinforcements to arrive. Later, when the battle turned and the snow began to melt, the Ghost Army moved on, quietly, without recognition. No medals were given, no headlines written. But in debriefings, commanders admitted the truth. The illusions had worked. The enemy had been slowed, misled, distracted, and thousands of Allied soldiers had lived because of it. For many in the 23rd, it was the first time their mission had felt indistinguishable from the war itself. Not apart from it, inside it. And though they would leave no statues, no visible scars on the battlefield, they knew what they had done. In the cold forests of Belgium, in one of the darkest hours of the war, they had become something more than shadows. They had become shields. By early 1945, the war in Europe was approaching its final desperate act. The Allies had pushed through France, liberated Belgium, and now stood at the banks of the Rhine River, the last natural barrier before the heart of Nazi Germany. It was wide, deep, defended, a line not only of geography but of pride. Hitler had ordered it held at all costs, and the Allies were preparing to cross it. Commanders knew the assault would be brutal. A river crossing under enemy fire could lead to staggering casualties. So the planners turned once more to the masters of illusion, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The Ghost Army was tasked with creating a false crossing, a massive, multi-layered deception to draw German eyes and guns away from the real assault site. The plan was ambitious. They would simulate an entire division preparing to cross the river, complete with fake tanks, fake engineers, fake radio chatter, and the sounds of heavy movement. The real crossing would take place far to the south. The operation began with reconnaissance. Officers from the 23rd surveyed the riverbanks, choosing a location that mirrored the real crossing site just enough to be believable, but far enough to divide enemy attention. Then, they built the illusion, Inflatable tanks and vehicles were set up behind embankments, half visible, just enough to tempt aerial reconnaissance. Large plywood barges and boats were assembled on the shoreline, painted and arranged as if waiting for deployment. Wooden crates marked bridging equipment were stacked in rows. Camouflage netting covered carefully shaped mounds of nothing. To the enemy in the sky, it looked like preparations were well underway. But that was only the first layer. At night, the sonic unit began playing the sounds of a full-scale engineering operation. The heavy slap of pontoon bridges being dropped into water, men shouting over current, vehicles starting, chains rattling. The speakers were hidden in forests, carefully aimed across the river to echo convincingly from the far bank. German scouts, watching from towers and listening through static, would hear an army on the move. Meanwhile, the radio team performed a carefully scripted play. Operators used call signs from a known U.S. division, transmitting realistic but false updates. Delays due to weather, bridge parts arriving late, engineers requesting more wire. Intercepts were intentionally sloppy, allowing the Germans to feel they had gleaned valuable intelligence. Everything pointed to one conclusion. A major river crossing was imminent at this site, and the Germans believed it. They moved units into position, redirected artillery, called in reinforcements from nearby sectors. Meanwhile, the real Allied forces, operating under the cover of this grand performance, launched their attack miles away, catching the defenders off guard and achieving their objective with far fewer casualties than anticipated. The bluff had worked, completely, and it had cost the Ghost Army nothing more than rubber, wood, wire, and imagination. In the aftermath, as the river behind them faded into memory, the men quietly packed up their false tanks and boats. Another illusion complete. Another battlefield shifted. But this time, the weight of their success felt different. The Rhine had been more than a river. It had been a symbol, a boundary the Nazis had sworn would never be crossed. And the Ghost Army had helped make that crossing possible not by force, but by conviction, by making the enemy believe in something that wasn't there. In the stillness that followed, one soldier wrote, "No bullets, no bridges, just our shadows stretching across the water, and on the far bank, silence." They had crossed the Rhine in their own way, not with boats, but with the power of suggestion. And with each illusion, each well-placed deception, the war moved closer to its end. Spring arrived in Europe with a strange silence. The thunder of artillery grew distant. The skies, once streaked with smoke and fire, softened into pale blue. Villages that had cowered in rubble and fear began to breathe again. And the great machines of war, tanks, planes, entire armies, began to slow. Germany was collapsing. By May of 1945, Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was over. The long nightmare that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years had ended. And somewhere in the shadows of that victory, the Ghost Army quietly disappeared. There were no parades for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, no newspaper headlines, no generals shaking hands in celebration. When the fighting stopped, they simply packed their bags, folded their rubber tanks, stored their speakers, shut down their radios, and waited for orders. In the days following VE Day, victory in Europe, many of the men sat in their tents and reflected. Some wrote letters home, saying they hoped to return before the leaves turned. Others sketched one last drawing of a camp that would never appear in history books. A few sat alone, watching the sun dip beneath the trees, unsure of what it all had meant. They had served in over 20 deception missions, impersonated dozens of divisions, and likely saved thousands of lives. Yet when the official records were compiled, their names were left out. Their unit's true purpose remained classified. Even their families didn't know what they had done. Some returned home to jobs in advertising, art, design, teaching. They became fathers, husbands, neighbors. When people asked about the war, they shrugged and offered vague replies. I worked with communications, one might say. Just moved around a lot. The truth was more complicated and heavier. In 1945, the U.S. Army sealed most of the records of the Ghost Army's operations. The deception tactics used, and the people behind them, were considered too sensitive to reveal. The fear was simple. One day, these tricks might be needed again. And so, for decades, their story faded into silence. The inflatable tanks gathered dust in warehouses. Field notes were boxed and stored. Photos were left uncaptioned. And the names of the men who built illusions in the smoke and shadow of war were rarely spoken. But they never forgot. At rare reunions, they shared memories. The time a mannequin guard was saluted by a general. The night they bluffed an entire panzer division. The moment they realized a single sound, played at just the right time, could change the direction of a battle. They remembered the fear, too. The risk. The sense that they had walked a tightrope through history, unseen and unarmed. They remembered the odd mixture of pride and anonymity, of being essential, but invisible. For many of them, that was enough. But time has a way of unburying truth. Decades later, as records were finally declassified, historians and filmmakers began piecing together fragments, letters, sketches, after-action reports. A fuller picture began to emerge, of a unit that had used creativity as a weapon and illusion as armor. Their story, once a ghost itself, slowly returned. Museums began to display their work. Documentaries were made. Congress was petitioned to honor them. And the phrase Ghost Army entered the public lexicon, not just as a curiosity, but as a symbol of what can be achieved when human imagination is wielded with discipline and purpose. But for those who were there, it had never been about recognition. It had been about saving lives, about doing what had to be done, about turning the tide of war without firing a shot. Now, as the world remembers them, it does so with the understanding that even the quietest efforts can leave the deepest marks. And though they fought with rubber and paint, with speakers and silence, the legacy of the Ghost Army has endured, not in statues or medals, but in the knowledge that their illusions were real enough to win a war. For decades, the Ghost Army lived only in whispers. There were no unit histories on library shelves, no declassified records easily available. The men who had painted shadows and projected sound into the fog of war had returned home to a world that celebrated tanks and generals, not illusionists. Their silence wasn't just humility, it was required. The missions of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were classified, buried beneath layers of secrecy by the U.S. Army. The tactics they used, visual deception, sonic projection, radio spoofing, were considered valuable national assets. The military believed they might be needed again. And so, the files were sealed. For those who had served, this silence became routine. When asked what they had done during the war, most answered with vague phrases, communications, logistics, or simply, I moved around a lot. Even close family members had no idea what their husbands, brothers, or fathers had really been doing between 1944 and 1945. And yet, some fragments survived. In old suitcases stored in attics, there were sketches, tanks made of rubber, tents populated by mannequins, notes in the margins marked, "Make it look heavier." Some men had kept their field notebooks, filled with carefully drawn diagrams and quiet reflections. A few had written unsent letters, now yellowed and delicate. Others had albums of photographs, uncaptioned, mysterious, showing tents that didn't seem quite real. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that the pieces slowly began to come together. Historians and documentary filmmakers, among them Rick Beyer, who would later become one of the leading voices behind the Ghost Army's rediscovery, began interviewing veterans who were finally willing or able to share what they had done. Bit by bit, a picture began to emerge. In 1996, several members of the unit gathered for an unofficial reunion. They brought with them their sketches, photos, and fading memories. And for the first time in decades, they told the truth. Not just to each other, but to the world. They told of nights setting up phantom camps under enemy observation, of walking through villages in borrowed uniforms, of drawing entire German divisions away from real troops. They spoke not with bravado, but with quiet pride. They hadn't saved the world, but they had made it safer for those who had. Their voices were calm, their stories surreal. One veteran recalled, "We weren't heroes in the traditional sense, but we fooled the Nazis. That was our job, and we did it well." These recollections led to the release of official records, long kept under wraps. Documents from the National Archives began to surface. Operation plans, fake radio scripts, maps, orders signed in coded names. Museums took notice. Historians filled in the gaps. And suddenly, the Ghost Army was no longer invisible. Their story appeared in articles, exhibitions, and eventually books. Students wrote theses on their work. Families, now armed with truth, spoke of their fathers and grandfathers with a new understanding. And for the first time, the name Ghost Army took its place among the honored units of World War II. But even then, many of the original members had already passed, their stories untold, their contributions unrecognized. Still, something remarkable happened. Those who remained began to speak not only for themselves, but for the men who couldn't. In interviews, they would mention names. George would have laughed at this, or Frank used to say, "We were the rubber division." They carried each other's memory like equipment across time, still serving in a way. In 2013, a documentary titled The Ghost Army was released on PBS, drawing international attention. It was gentle, reflective, just like the men it honored. That same year, a movement began to award the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. The campaign took years. Letters were written, testimonies submitted. Veterans testified before Congress. Lawmakers heard, some for the first time, about the fake tanks, the sonic warfare, the radio deception, and the courage it took to stand in as a target. And in 2022, more than 75 years after the war, the U.S. Congress passed the bill to honor them. The president signed it into law. The Ghost Army would, at last, receive its recognition. It had taken a lifetime, but the truth had endured, not just in ink and film, but in the invisible spaces between history's official lines, in the lives saved by distraction, in the battles won by shadows, in the legacy left by men who pretended, so that others could fight for real. A story almost lost, but not forgotten. They were never meant to be seen. They arrived in silence, set their stage in darkness, and vanished before dawn, leaving behind tire tracks that led nowhere, voices that had never spoken, and tanks that folded into canvas bags. But their legacy remained. The men of the Ghost Army were not conquerors or combat heroes. They didn't storm beaches or take cities. Their war was quieter, a war of shadows and suggestion, of art and illusion. And yet, through deception, they saved lives. Through lies, they told a deeper truth. That imagination, when wielded with courage, can shift the tide of history. We remember them not for the weapons they carried, but for the ones they didn't. Not for the battles they fought, but for the ones they prevented. They turned paint into armor, sound into fear, silence into strategy. And they did it all under the weight of secrecy, knowing their victories would never make headlines, their stories never taught in schools. Now, years later, we say their names out loud. We remember the sculptors who built fake artillery, the sound engineers who created ghostly armies in the trees, the radio men who spoke in voices that weren't theirs, and the artists who turned war into theater. Not to glorify it, but to lessen its cost. Their legacy is not just military. It is human. It reminds us that there is power in creativity, that quiet service matters, that even in the darkest hours of war, there are those who choose not destruction, but illusion. Not bullets, but brushstrokes. Tonight, as you rest, know that the story you've heard is real. That somewhere, on forgotten fields beneath foreign skies, men once stood in quiet courage and made the enemy believe in something that wasn't there, so that others might live. They were the illusionists of war, and we remember them still. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me, exploring the forgotten corners of history where shadows once moved in silence and stories were written without glory. If you found this journey meaningful, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Each week, we'll bring you another calm story from the past, to relax with, to reflect on, or simply to fall asleep to. You can also leave a comment below. I'd love to know what moments stood out to you. or which story you'd like to hear next. And if you'd like to support the channel, a like or a share helps more than you know. But for now, let the night wrap around you like a soft blanket. Let the voices of the past fade gently into dreams. Sleep well, and until next time, stay curious,